In our introductory section on the Iranian nuclear program, we've presented the major question facing the United States and its allies. How do you create an agreement that has a chance of slowing Iran's progress on each of several pathways to a nuclear weapon? And we learned that while it may not be possible to stop a nation from building a weapon, it may well be possible to design an agreement that slows the process, so that the world would have a year or more's notice if Iran ever decided to race for a bomb. Of course, the Iranians say they have no intention of building a nuclear weapon. But the world wants to be able to verify that rather than simply trust Iran's assurances.
So as we drill down on this today, we fortunately have three students with us, Henry, Esther, and Josh. And we're going to be looking at an even harder question about red lines, that is, lines that a state cannot move across without penalties. How do you enforce red lines? In international diplomacy, leaders often draw red lines, but a red line's got to define clearly enough an action that another country can't take without suffering major consequences to be credible.
Well, Graham, you wrote about red lines, the red lines that President Kennedy drew and those that he later on erased during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Now, that was more than 50 years ago, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But far more recently, there's been another red line case. President Obama famously drew a red line, he called it that, saying it would change his calculus about entering the Syrian civil war if the government in Syria ever used chemical weapons against its own people. Now, President Bashar al-Assad ignored that red line, and while the president did end up threatening military intervention and came this close to it, really just a day away, he ended up with a negotiated settlement that shipped about 1,400 tons of chemical weapons out of the country. In the Iranian case, of course, we've heard leaders draw a number of different red lines. Both the United States and Israel have issued decrees to Iran about steps beyond which they couldn't step. And of course, Graham, you've put together some pretty interesting material to indicate that many of these red lines have been, what's your polite word, retired over the past few years.
Well, that's not made some of our friends in government happy, but I think the picture tells you that the red lines have been drawn, they've been crossed, and then they've been moved. So if you go back to the steps that you need to get a nuclear bomb, Iran has crossed almost every one of these steps, particularly specific steps people said they couldn't take. So a series of American presidents and Israeli prime ministers drew these red lines. Each time Iran stepped right over them, and usually we retreated to the next red line and pushed the repeat button.
Well, of course, Graham, President Obama would argue otherwise in this case. He would say that he's drawn one red line, and it's a simple one, that Iran will not be permitted to obtain a nuclear weapon. Now, that's not only what he's told me, it's not only what he's told you, it's what he's told his Secretary of State, John Kerry, who's been negotiating with the Iranians for more than a year. So let's hear Mr. Kerry's own description of the president's red line.
Ensuring that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon has been the heart of President Obama's foreign policy from the moment that he took office. It has not changed. And when he talked to me about the prospect of becoming Secretary of State, I looked at him and I said, Mr. President, I want to know for certain that what you're saying about Iran and what the consequences may be if we can't get where we need to go in a deal are real. I mean, are we going to hold them accountable? And the president looked at me and he said, Iran will not get a nuclear weapon and I will do whatever is necessary.
Well, professors, after listening to that, I wanted to ask, when President Obama is quoted as saying, whatever is necessary, is there a credible military commitment on the American side?
Well, I would say many in Israel and probably some in Iran are thinking that same question. So when the statement says Iran will not get a nuclear bomb, the question is, or what? And when the president says, I'll do whatever is necessary, the answer is, what does that include? Oftentimes, there's a vague threat of force without too much specificity, and that often leads other people to say, well, how credible is this threat? So I think the question today that many people are asking is how credible is the threat from President Obama to act if Iran should actually have succeeded in getting a nuclear bomb. And we saw this story in North Korea, where President Bush, somebody clearly not unwilling to use military force, kept drawing red lines for North Korea. North Korea stepped across them over one and then the next, eventually getting a nuclear bomb without getting bombed. So the question of how close a state can get to a bomb without triggering action, and what actions can be threatened at that point, that they're credible if they should go the last step, is a very difficult question.
Well, you're right, Graham. And of course, you have to remember that not everyone draws the red line in the same place, and that can add to the confusion. For example, the Israelis have a very different standard than the United States has. The Israelis say they will not let the Iranians get what they call a nuclear capability to build a weapon. Now, the Israelis in particular worry that we might not ever know if Iran decided to dash for a bomb. So they want to make sure that they are kept as far away from the technological capability to build one as possible. So that, let's say if one day the Iranians threw out the inspectors and decided to race for a bomb, exactly what the North Koreans did back in the 1990s, then there'd be time to stop them. Now, a few years ago, the Israelis came up with a new phrase to define their red line. They said that the Iranians could not move into what they called a zone of immunity. And that was the point at which their nuclear program was so advanced that its components were buried so deep into the mountains of Iranian tunnels that the Israelis felt they would no longer have a credible option to destroy it in a bombing raid. Now, the surprise came in September of 2012, and that's when Prime Minister Netanyahu changed that red line again. Of course, he didn't say he was changing it. No one ever does.
Well, he didn't say he didn't change it. He simply, they're having moved into the zone of immunity, he retired that.
That's right. And so effectively, he moved on to a new red line. Let's listen to what he said. He did it right in front of the United Nations.
There's only one way to peacefully prevent Iran from getting atomic bombs, and that's by placing a clear red line on Iran's nuclear weapons program. Red lines don't lead to war. Red lines prevent war. Just look at NATO's charter. It made clear that an attack on one member country would be considered an attack on all. And NATO's red line helped keep the peace in Europe for nearly half a century. President Kennedy said a red line during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That red line also prevented war and helped preserve the peace for decades. In fact, it's the failure to place red lines that's often invited aggression.
Now, after the Prime Minister gave this interesting little lecture about red lines, he set a new one, and it's one the Israelis say they're sticking to this day.
So how much enriched uranium do you need for a bomb? And how close is Iran to getting it? This is a bomb. This is a fuse. In the case of Iran's nuclear plans to build a bomb, this bomb has to be filled with enough enriched uranium. And Iran has to go through 3 stages. The first stage, they have to enrich enough low enriched uranium. The second stage, they have to enrich enough medium enriched uranium. And the third stage and final stage, they have to enrich enough high enriched uranium for the first bomb. Where's Iran? Iran's completed the first stage. Took them many years, but they completed it, and they're 70% of the way there. Now they're well into the second stage. And by next spring, at most, by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment, and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've told you now is not based on secret information. It's not based on military intelligence. It's based on the public reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Anybody could read them. They're online. So if these are the facts, and they are, where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here. Before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb, before Iran gets to a point where it's a few months away or a few weeks away from amassing enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon.
So, Esther, let me ask you, is that red line drawn in the right place? Is it an effective way of stopping Iran?
Well, there's definitely something to what he said about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that case, the U.S. clearly set out a limit as to what was acceptable for the U.S., set a red line, and there was a credible commitment by the U.S. that they would not accept anybody breaching that red line. The Soviets believed the U.S. commitment, and they also felt that it was an acceptable place for them.
Well, Graham, you spent a few decades looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. You wrote a pretty famous book about it. What do you think? Is Esther giving us the right analysis here?
Well, I would say as a first approximation, yes. So basically, at the outset of the missile crisis, Kennedy said this can't stand, that he would not accept Cuba being turned into a base for nuclear-tipped Soviet missiles, and that the missiles had to be withdrawn, and that he was prepared to go to war to prevent the Soviet Union establishing this base for strategic nuclear forces in Cuba. He made the threat credible. He ultimately set out the conditions, the combination of a very clear red line and a credible threat, and together they succeeded.
Well, any thoughts about where Prime Minister Netanyahu set this latest Israeli red line? Josh?
Well, this situation seems a little different to me than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the complication here is that the red line as articulated by President Obama has been no nuclear weapons. And as we discussed, that can be ambiguous in both political and technical terms. And it doesn't always mesh with the red line that Prime Minister Netanyahu set. So what does it mean when two allies basically announce two different red lines?
Well, that's another good question, and there's no doubt that there are two different red lines here. So I'll let David answer the hard part of the question. But the easy part is that you can see in Prime Minister Netanyahu somebody who's laboring painfully with a real predicament. So he knows that Iran has already gone most of the way to the bomb. He knows that many of the red lines that he announced himself over the years have been retired. So he thinks this is the last place short of a nuclear bomb where if Iran crosses this line, it would not be able to be discovered in time to be interrupted. So President Obama, as you said, has a different articulation of the red line. He says Iran will never be allowed to get a nuclear bomb. So how you make these two jibe, that's a good question for David.
Well, thanks a lot, Graham. That's a really great place to try to take off from this. Well, you know, there are some Obama administration officials who told me that they actually tried to convince Prime Minister Netanyahu's staff that drawing a very clear red line where he drew it could be more than a little bit dangerous because, as we've discussed, there are many paths to a bomb, and their fear was the Iranians would just choose another path. So the alternative has been that President Obama has been very vague about where the line is, other than, as Graham says, getting a bomb. Now, in fact, let's listen to what President Obama said in 2008. He was running for president at the time, to the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee in a speech that he gave to them.
I will do everything in my power to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Everything in my power to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Everything.
Now, that's a great soundbite for a candidate, particularly one in the middle of a pretty heated presidential election. But listen carefully to where he put that line. The line is at the very end stage. It's when Iran actually gets a nuclear weapon. And then think about what we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was, I'm not going to let Iran get the capability to walk up to that point. So he's not putting the line at the end, he's putting it midway. Now, just before he went to Israel in the spring of 2013, President Obama was asked in an interview that he did with Israeli television about where his line was. And let's take a listen to that.
I have been crystal clear about my position on Iran possessing a nuclear weapon. That is a red line for us. It's something that would not only be dangerous for Israel, but would be dangerous for the world. Right now, we think that it would take over a year or so for Iran to actually develop a nuclear weapon, but obviously we don't want to cut it too close. And what we're going to be doing is to continue to engage internationally with Iran, understanding that we've set up the toughest sanctions ever. It's having a significant effect. If we can resolve it diplomatically, that's a more lasting solution. But if not, I continue to keep all options on the table.
So in this interview, what the president seems to say is, I'm not going to let them get a weapon, but you can't wait till the very last moment. He's coming a little bit closer to the Netanyahu line. There's a time just before they could get that weapon where you have to act, because at some point you won't have enough time to react. So this seemed to me to be an effort just before the president went to Israel to close the gap between the definition that Prime Minister Netanyahu has given to this problem and the definition that the president had drawn before.
So I think you're just right. So Prime Minister Netanyahu has been skeptical about whether there's any agreement that would be acceptable to Israel, that would also be acceptable to the Supreme Leader of Iran. Indeed, he believes there's no such possibility, and he thinks this issue is not going to go away.
Well, exactly. And meanwhile, I predict you're going to see that no one's going to want to declare that Iran stepped over a red line. Now, the Iranians are going to make this a little bit easier, of course, by staying away from that red line that Prime Minister Netanyahu set.
Well, this will be an interesting drama to watch because there are at least some people in the U.S. government that believes he'll do what they call crowding the red line. So he'll go right up to the edge, 250 kilos of MEU, and then maybe go a little bit across for one day and then switch back to fuel the next day. So we're going to see an interesting test of this if the current negotiations fail.
That's right. And so for anybody who's walked down the street in New York and you've seen the 3-card Monty act go on, you know, that's where you're trying to figure out what card is underneath the cup. And that's a lot of what this is looking like today. So we'll move on, and in the next segment, we'll discuss some of the president's other options beyond drawing red lines and beyond the negotiations.